Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at the problem of personal identity. Of course there are many problems relating to personal identity, but we will focus on the problem of persistence over time. So in some sense I'm the same person today as I was yesterday. If the person named Kane Baker, who runs a philosophy account on YouTube, committed an armed robbery yesterday, the police would be knocking on my door today. I survive over time. The question is, what does this survival consist in? What determines whether a past or future being is me? When I look at a school photo, I can identify myself among the children. I can point at one of the kids and say, that's me. Yet the person talking to you right now is very different in many respects from the person sitting there in the school photo. So I say that, that this child in the photo is me. What exactly is it that makes him me? We can start to motivate thinking about personal identity by considering a famous science fiction case. You're all familiar with the idea of teleportation. Let's be clear about what teleportation involves. You have two boxes, A and B. You step into box A, and this performs a complete scan of your body. The position of every single atom in your body is noted. This information is then sent to box B. At this point, your body is destroyed. It's vaporized. At the same time, box B instantaneously creates a new version of your body based on the information it was sent. This body is molecule for molecule identical to your old one. Assuming that the mind arises from processes going on in the brain and body, it follows that this body has an identical mind to yours as well. For all anybody would know, the person stepping out of box B is you. Now this is obviously a fantasy, but in principle, if we had sufficiently brilliant technology, presumably it would be possible. The question is, what exactly happens in teleportation? There are two views that we might take. On one view, teleportation is a form of travel. You step into box A and bang, you travel at the speed of light to box B, where you then get out and resume your activities. More pessimistically, teleportation is suicide. You get into box A and you're killed, and a perfect copy is created in box B. But that copy isn't you. From your perspective, you get into box A, you press a button, and then it's non-existence for eternity. At exactly the same time, a new person pops into existence in box B. Of course, they don't feel like a new person. They think they remember getting in the teleporter, but they're wrong. My own intuition, I might as well say, is that teleportation is suicide. It's always struck me as kind of obvious that teleportation is suicide, but I found that many people have the opposite intuition. So, who knows? If you do think that teleportation is survivable, it may be worth reflecting on this case. Suppose you step into box A, and as before, you're scanned. The information is sent to box B, where your body, where this sort of copy of your body is created. But at the same time, the wiping mechanism fails. So you step out of box A, and a perfect copy steps out of box B. Which one is you? Presumably the one from box A. But in that case, what sense does it make to say that if the person in box A were destroyed, you'd be the person in box B? So, there's a lot to think about there. Now, probably the most famous account of personal identity derives from John Locke. This is the view that identity consists in some sort of psychological continuity over time. So a person at time t1 is the same as a person at time t2, just in case the person at t2 in some sense inherits psychological features from the person at t1. If you look at me yesterday and me today, we both have the same personality, we both have basically the same desires and goals, we both have the same taste in music, we both remember essentially the same things about the past. The psychological features I exhibit today are inherited from the psychological features of the person called Kane Baker, who ran a philosophy channel on YouTube, who was here yesterday. I think this theory seems initially pretty plausible. We can motivate it by considering a a brain swap scenario. Suppose that Vincent has Alzheimer's and he wants a new brain. So Frank's good brain is transplanted into Vincent's body. Now, it seems that the resulting person is just Frank. In other words, it's not really possible to swap your brain with somebody else's brain. We haven't given Vincent Frank's brain. Rather, Vincent is dead, and now Frank has a new body. This is a body swap, not a brain swap. Of course, this isn't the case with any other organ. We could take Frank's liver and transplant it into Vincent's body. In that case, Vincent has a new liver. So why is the brain special? Well, the intuition, of course, is that the brain is the seat of the mind. The brain is what ultimately realises most of our psychological capacities. If we put Frank's brain in Vincent's body, the resulting person will have all or at least most of Frank's psychological traits. So if we say that the resulting person just is Frank, and this does seem to be what we want to say, presumably we're adopting some sort of psychological criterion of identity. We're saying that what matters is the psychology. As long as the psychological traits survive, then you survive. Now, an important feature of persons is that psychological traits change over time. You might have a totally different psychological makeup later in life than what you do earlier in life. Now, this might seem difficult to account for in the psychological continuity theory. Basically, the problem here is that personal identity is transitive, whereas psychological traits, or rather psychological similarity, is not. If X is the same person as Y, and Y is the same person as Z, then X must be the same person as Z. On the other hand, if X is psychologically similar to Y and Y is psychologically similar to Z, this doesn't entail that X is psychologically similar to Z. If we consider each year in a person's life, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, up to 80, each year is sort of psychologically similar to the years before and after it, but there might be almost no overlap whatsoever between, for example, year 5 and year 75. If you look at the person as a 5-year-old and the person as a 75-year-old, they might be totally different. Now, there are 2 points that we can make to account for this on the continuity theory. First, on this theory, a necessary feature for personal identity over time is overlapping chains of psychological states. So suppose as a simplified model that a person has only 3 psychological states at any one time. And the person develops like this: ABC, ABF, DBF, obviously A, B and C and F and so on. They're all psychological traits. Now we can see that that by the end, this person is completely different than they were at the beginning. They share literally no traits at all in common. But they can still count as the same person on the psychological continuity theory, because you move from 1 to 7 in like a series of simple changes. There is overlap between the person at 1 and the person at 2. There's overlap between the person at 2 and the person at 3, and so on. And so these overlaps are necessary for personal identity. Second, another important element of personal identity over time, at least on most psychological continuity theories, is causal dependence. A person at a later point in her life has the psychological traits she does, largely because of the psychological traits she had at an earlier point in her life. For example, a particular experience causes a particular memory. In this example, C might refer to a dream, and F might be the memory of a dream. The later psychological profile is partially caused by the earlier psychological profile. The beliefs you hold now are there partly because they were there last night. If an evil genius scientist had gone into your head yesterday and performed brain surgery, carefully deleting all of your beliefs about, say, China, you wouldn't have any beliefs about China right now. There are chains of causal dependence. And that, of course, is the case even if your beliefs change in various ways. If you have, let's say you have some different beliefs in a year's time, it's still the case that those beliefs that you have then are what they are, partially because of the beliefs that you hold now. You can sort of trace the causal dependence. Causal dependence is important because it could be the case that two people have very similar psychologies. I mean, this isn't at all likely in real life, but again, consider a simplified model. Suppose we have two people who develop like this. One is ABC, ABF, DBF, DBI. The other is GHI, DHI, DEI. The question is, how do we know that DBI is a continuation of the first person rather than the second person? You can see that DBI overlaps to the same extent with both DBF and DEI. In each case, there's just one change. Well, the thought is it's because DBI is causally dependent on DBF and not DEI. And in real life, it's easy to track lines of causal dependence because we know that the psychological states associated with a particular body will be causally dependent on the earlier states associated with that body. So these 2 points, overlap and causal dependence, that allows the psychological continuity theory to explain how personal identity can survive psychological changes over time. As long as there is overlap and as long as there is this kind of causal dependence of later states on earlier states, then we can say that that a person at a later point in their life is the same person as at an earlier point in their life. So what does this theory tell us about the teleportation case? Well, whether or not we can survive teleportation depends on what kind of continuity counts. Obviously, there is almost total overlap between the psychologies of the person who goes into box A and the person who comes out of box B. Furthermore, there's clearly a causal dependence here as well. The psychology of the person coming out is what it is partially because of the psychology of the person going in. If the original person's psychology had been different in particular ways, the second person's psychology would have been different in just those ways as well, because the machine reads the first person's psychology and uses that to construct the second person's psychology. On the other hand, psychological continuity is usually secured by the physical continuity of the brain. This isn't the case for teleportation. There's clearly a very significant kind of disruption between box A and box B. So we can make the psychological continuity theory narrower by saying that only a particular kind of continuity counts. Perhaps we can add the condition that there must also be a continuity of the physical matter that realises the psychological traits. That's the case in normal circumstances. There's usually also a continuity of physical matter, and that's not there in the teleportation case. So, what this theory would say about teleportation depends on exactly how you develop the theory. Right, let's consider some problems for the psychological continuity view. A famous objection to this theory is that explicating personal identity in psychological terms is circular. Let's take memory. Let's say that Frank remembers punching Vincent. The psychological continuity theory says, well, we can say that Frank at T1, who punches Vincent, is the Frank at a later time T2, who remembers punching Vincent, in virtue of the fact that Frank at T2's memory of the event establishes a psychological continuity between the two Franks. But the problem with this is that to say that Frank remembers punching Vincent implies that Frank did punch Vincent. You can't remember things that didn't happen. Frank might incorrectly believe that he punched Vincent, but he can't remember punching Vincent if he didn't actually do it. When a person claims to remember being abducted by aliens, we would say they don't really remember this. They think they remember it, but they don't. So to say that Frank remembers punching Vincent is to implicitly assume that Frank at T1 and Frank at T2 are the same person. So the psychological continuity theory is circular. There are a couple of obvious responses to this. First of all, I'm not convinced that we do treat memories as necessarily accurate. After all, there's nothing unusual about talking about false memories. We might say, for instance, the the psychiatrist's leading questions caused the patient to develop false memories of childhood abuse, or something like that. That seems a reasonable statement, something we might say of a bad psychiatrist. Second, even if we do treat memories as necessarily accurate, that's really just a semantic point. The circularity objection is easily averted by simply defining new psychological predicates. So we can talk not about memory, but rather about quasi-memory. A quasi-memory can be either veridical or mistaken. And if you analyse personal identity in those terms, there would be no circularity. The second objection is sleep. Presumably, the organism named Kane Baker, who was sleeping in my bed yesterday, was me. But during sleep, there are no psychological traits at all, at least not, at least when you're not dreaming. So there doesn't seem to be any psychological continuity between me and the organism that was sleeping in my bed. The primary response to this is that we have to keep in mind that many psychological traits are dispositional. Indeed, whether you're awake or asleep, most of your psychological traits are not being accessed by your consciousness. You have all sorts of memories and beliefs and desires that you're not currently conscious of. It's perfectly reasonable to say of a sleeping person that, for example, he desires a long and healthy life, or he believes the Earth orbits the barycenter of the solar system, or whatever. Conscious awareness is just one part, in some ways quite a minor part of our minds. And we might add that, in general, the more important psychological traits tend to be the dispositional ones. Traits like your personality, your values, your beliefs, your memories. These are all dispositional. They don't disappear when you go to sleep. Your personality doesn't disappear when you go to sleep because it's a disposition. It's not always being realised, as it were. So the psychological discontinuity from wakefulness to sleep, this concerns only the more immediate experiential traits, your immediate perceptions and sensations. So I think that sleep can be accommodated by the continuity theory. But a more serious problem along the same lines is posed in cases where a person's psychology, including their dispositional states, undergoes a sudden and radical change. A famous example of this is Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad construction worker in the 1800s who was hammering a large tamping rod into the ground. The rod hit some blasting powder which exploded. And the rod shot up. It went straight through his face, through his left eye, and out through the top of his head, destroying his left frontal lobe. Here's a photo of Gage holding the rod, and here's a drawing of the path of the rod. It sort of entered just below the eye and shot straight through his skull. So you can see it did quite a lot of damage. Unsurprisingly, this had quite profound psychological changes. Gage became more irritable, more impulsive, he lost the ability to control himself, he became something of a drifter, unable to hold down steady work, whereas before the accident he was a very kind of good worker and very kind of conscientious and very mild-mannered. That all changed. He suddenly became impulsive and irritable, and so the accident had severe consequences on his emotions and his rational capacities. That's the usual story, at any rate. That's actually somewhat controversial. If you read about Gage, some people have said that the extent of Gage's psychological changes has been exaggerated, but we can certainly imagine something like this really happening. It could be the case that a person sustains a severe brain injury that radically alters their personality. A similar example is provided by dissociative fugue states. These are states which involve severe amnesia and the establishment of a new identity. William James described the case of a reverend called Ansel Bourne, who was a preacher in Rhode Island. One day he just forgot his whole life as a preacher. He travelled across the state to Pennsylvania, where he opened and ran a small shop. A few months later he woke up one night, he remembered everything about being a preacher, but had forgotten everything that happened in the fugue state. So it was as if, for a few weeks, he had become a different person. But this is the crucial point. It was as if he became a different person. But would we say that he really became a different person? Well, arguably this would be too strong. The more natural thing to say is that the Reverend, the person who is the Reverend, he entered a state of amnesia and altered personality. Similarly for Phineas Gage. Did Phineas Gage cease to exist when the pipe went through his head? Well, that's presumably not. He changed drastically, but he didn't cease to exist. And this is difficult to account for on the psychological continuity theory because, well, clearly in these cases, psychological traits are fundamentally altered. Even the dispositional traits are fundamentally altered. It's not simply that they are kind of merely unrealised due to sleep or whatever. They're totally different. Phineas Gage has a totally different personality. Of course, in response to this, the defender of the psychological continuity theory might just bite the bullet. Perhaps Phineas Gage really did become a different person when the rod went through his head. The original person ceased to exist, and a new, rather less pleasant person took his place. Or alternatively, the defender of the continuity theory could try to argue that even with people like Gage, there was still substantial overlap in the psychologies. There's enough of an overlap before the accident and after the accident to count them as the same person. So there are many ways we could take that argument. The third problem is posed by cases of fission and fusion. So first, fission. Suppose that one half of your brain is destroyed. Presumably the resulting person is still you. There is in fact a surgical procedure known as hemispherectomy, in which an entire hemisphere of the brain is removed. Surprisingly, not only are patients able to recover nearly normal functioning, but it tends to have quite limited psychological effects. So even their personalities, their sense of humour, their memories are largely intact, despite the removal of an entire half of their brain. So now suppose we take one half of your brain and put it in one head, and another half of your brain and put it in another head. Let's call the recipients Evan and Parker. Now Evan and Parker are both psychologically continuous with you. They both remember the life that you had, they both have similar personalities as you, they both have similar goals and dreams as you. By the psychological continuity theory, it seems that you are Evan and you are Parker. But this can't be right. If you're Evan and you're Parker, then Evan and Parker are the same person. But clearly, Evan and Parker are different people. Sometimes Evan will feel hungry while Parker is completely full. Sometimes Evan will have a sudden shock while Parker is sound asleep. Sometimes Evan will be watching a movie while Parker is at work. If Evan committed a crime, you wouldn't hold Parker responsible. So we can't say that they're the same person. They each have different experiences and they will drift further apart as time goes on. Fission might actually happen in real life with split brain patients. Bands of nerves called commissures link each cerebral cortex. The largest of these is the corpus callosum. These commissures transmit information from one hemisphere to another, and so they allow the brain to function as a unified whole. However, there is a surgical procedure known as a commissurotomy, in which the corpus callosum is severed, and this is used to treat cases of very severe epilepsy. Sometimes people have severe epilepsy that is unresponsive to other treatments, and where the seizures tend to start in one localized place in one hemisphere and then spread via the corpus callosum to the other hemisphere. Simply splitting the corpus callosum is actually a fairly effective way of treating these people. But the consequence is that the two hemispheres of the brain can no longer, as it were, talk to each other so effectively, and they operate more independently. Now, arguably, when people have their brains split in this way, each hemisphere has a separate consciousness. And there have been some really interesting experiments which seem to show that there are two people in the same head. A simple example is what you can do is you make the patient visually fixate on one point, and then you show a photograph only to their left visual field. Let's say a photo of an elephant. Now each visual field connects to one hemisphere. The left visual field connects to the right hemisphere, the right visual field connects to the left hemisphere. The basic anatomy is shown in this diagram. You can see that different halves of each eye connect to different hemispheres, so that the sort of the left field over here ends up being projected to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field is projected to the left hemisphere. So in the experiment I described, let's say get the patient to fixate so their eyes don't move, and you show a photo of an elephant just in the left visual field. Because the photo is presented only to the left visual field, their right hemisphere sees the elephant, but the left hemisphere doesn't. Another thing that's important to note here is that many skills are somewhat lateralized. In particular, speech is primarily controlled by areas in the left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere, which does not control speech, sees the elephant photo. The left hemisphere doesn't see it, and the left hemisphere is the one that controls speech. So now let's say you lay out 10 photos, including the elephant photo, and you ask the patient to verbally say which one they were shown. They won't be able to say, because the left hemisphere that controls speech doesn't know. But if you then tell them to point to the image with their left hand, which is controlled primarily by the right hemisphere, they'll point to the right one. Or if you give them a piece of paper and ask them to draw what they saw, again, they'll be able to draw it. And yet if you then ask them to verbally say, again, they'll still verbally insist that they don't know. They'll say, no, I didn't see any of them, or whatever. And if you point out, well, you're able to guess the correct one, they'll say, yeah, but it was just a guess. I didn't actually know. Again, this is the left hemisphere talking. How is it that, if you ask how is it that you're able to point to the correct one, they'll say it was just a guess. Now, outside of specially constructed testing conditions, split brain patients tend to function relatively normally, although conflicts can sometimes occur, especially shortly after the operation. Some patients report that one hand tries to bring food closer while the other hand tries to push the food away. So it's like one hemisphere wants the food, the other hemisphere doesn't. Or one hand might be putting on a shirt while the other hand is trying to take the shirt off. Sometimes arms with different goals will actually fight each other. Now I should note that you have to be careful drawing conclusions from these examples, because generally speaking, both hemispheres seem to work together very well, even in split brain cases. So these sorts of conflicts are rare, but it does seem that at least sometimes one person has split into two. And you can design these experimental conditions which allow us to see that. So that may be an example of fission. Fusion is the opposite of fission. Suppose that one half of Frank's brain is destroyed, one half of Vincent's brain is destroyed. The two remaining halves are connected together and transplanted into a new body. Seemingly, we have created a fusion of Frank and Vincent. This person will have many of Frank's psychological traits and many of Vincent's psychological traits. He'll have many of Frank's memories and many of Vincent's memories. In some sense, both Frank and Vincent have survived this operation. I mean, if you were told that one half of your brain was going to be fused with another person's, you might be pretty unhappy about that, but you probably wouldn't consider it to be the end of your existence. So the problem here is that on the psychological continuity theory, this new person is Frank. But on the psychological continuity theory, this person is also Vincent, which means that Frank is Vincent. But we know from what's happened in the past that Frank is not Vincent. Frank and Vincent were born to different parents at different times, and they've done all sorts of different things. Let's say we have a picture of Frank as a child. If Frank just is Vincent, then it's legitimate to point at that picture and say, oh, that's Vincent. But obviously that child isn't Vincent. At the time that the photo was taken, Vincent was off hundreds of miles away doing something completely different. So, how might we respond to fission and fusion cases? Well, one response says that we have to consider the person's entire lifetime. If there is a fission in your future, then even now there are two people occupying your body and your mind, doing and thinking exactly the same things. If there is a fusion, then in the future, two people will come to occupy the same body and mind, but there'll still be two people. Here's a diagram of the whole lifeline, as it were. In a normal person, their lifeline looks like this, just a person. This is a fission case, and this is a fusion case. Let's say that Frank has a fission in his future. Well, if we look at Frank now, so suppose we're here, well, obviously there's no indication that there's anything other than one person there. But when we look at the entire lifetime of Frank, we see the divergence. Really, fission and fusion should be diagrammed like this. We're not aware that there are two people before a fission or two people after a fusion, because they're both located in exactly the same place and they both do and think exactly the same things. But there are two people no matter what, even before the fission occurs and even after the fusion. Of course, this view depends on a somewhat controversial metaphysics. On some theories of the nature of time, the future is simply indeterminate. There are no facts about what happens in the future. I mean, this gets us into philosophy of time, which would be a bit of a tangent here, but if this view is right, then actually we can't consider a person's entire lifetime. We can only judge personal identity by the events that have occurred up until now. If the future is indeterminate, then of course there's no fact of the matter whether or not there's a fission in my future. So it wouldn't make sense to say that we have to consider the whole lifetime of a person from birth to death. We can only do that once their lifetime is up. But right now, we would just have to say that there is, given we just have to look at the events that have happened to me right now when we judge my personal identity. And since obviously there has not been a fission event or a fusion event, then it looks like we just have to say that I'm just one person. But another response, perhaps along similar lines, is suggested by Roland Puchetti in his article, The Case for Mental Duality. He suggests, as before, that with split brains or with fission, there are two people all along, but they act in perfect unison. His argument has nothing to do with the metaphysics of time. According to Puchetti, even in people who never undergo a fission, there are two persons. And this is because each hemisphere is a person. Each hemisphere, each brain hemisphere, is separately conscious, even in normal people. Splitting the corpus callosum merely makes this duality of personhood and consciousness apparent. But it's always there, it's just hidden in normal people. Under normal conditions, the two people are so similar and they work together so closely, they each sort of constantly provide information for the other, that we don't realise that there are two of them. But there are two of them. So this is quite a radical view. Puchetti is saying that in your head right now, presumably you haven't had a split brain operation or anything like that, but in your head right now, there are actually two people. There are two consciousnesses, as it were, two centres of consciousness. One for your left hemisphere, one for your right hemisphere. Of course, you don't realise that. From the point of view of each consciousness, it's the only one in there. But no, there are two, according to Puchetti. So, what are his arguments for this? It's quite a radical idea. Well, first of all, one thought here is, look, the corpus callosum is essentially just a channel of communication. It transmits information from one hemisphere to another. But if this is its function, it's natural to treat each hemisphere separately. Bear in mind that in split brain patients, even in split brain cases, in most circumstances in everyday life, they function normally. Specific experimental setups or difficulties shortly after the operation make the separation of hemispheres apparent, but most of the time they're just like you and me, and they neither behave in ways that suggest separation, nor do they have any conscious awareness of separation. They'll verbally report being sort of feeling like they're just one person. But of course, it's that verbal report is the left hemisphere speaking. You could ask, as it were, the right hemisphere, well, how do you feel? Do you think there's just one person? Obviously, they will also report from the right hemisphere that they're just one person as well, because from each hemisphere's point of view, it feels like there's only one person in there. So they'll verbally report being one person, and if you ask them to, write down how many persons are in the head, they'll write down there's only one, because in each case, each hemisphere, is just, it feels like one. So that's one thing that we might bear in mind here, that actually in most circumstances, even though we know split brain patients do have two centres of consciousness in their head, they act as if there is only one. Why should we think that normal people are different? So the second argument here is, consider the following experimental setup. Take a split brain patient. What you do is you ask them to fixate on a point so that their eyes are totally steady, and then you project, give them the word teacup, right? Project the word teacup so that the word tea is in the left visual field and the word cup is in the right visual field. So the right hemisphere gets the word tea, which comes from the left visual field, and the left hemisphere gets the word cup, which comes from the right visual field. Now, if you ask them what word they saw, the left hemisphere will verbally report that it saw the word cup, while the right hemisphere will be able to non-verbally indicate that it saw the word tea. A normal person in the same condition would, of course, just see the word teacup. Now, how does this work? Well, in a normal person, information is sent from each hemisphere to the other. So, in each hemisphere, half the word registers in the Brodmann area 17 of the visual cortex. This is the half of the word that comes directly from the eye. So the left hemisphere receives the word cup directly from the eye, and the right hemisphere receives the word tea directly from the eye. The other half of the word probably registers first in the pre-strike cortex. The left hemisphere registers the word T in the pre-strike cortex after receiving information sent from the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere gets the word T directly from the eye, sends information to the left hemisphere, so it registers T in a separate place. And then obviously the opposite occurs in the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere gets the word cup in the pre-strike cortex. So for the left hemisphere, you get cup directly from the eye, and then you get T from the right hemisphere, and it combines them. Now, the crucial point here is that in a normal patient, the word teacup is registered in both hemispheres. Half of it comes directly from visual input, and the other half comes from information sent by the other hemisphere. But the point is that teacup is registered in both the left and the right hemispheres. The question is then, if consciousness spans both hemispheres, so that there's just one consciousness in each head, why do we read teacup and not teacup, teacup? Because again, you've got the word teacup essentially being generated twice. It's registered in the left hemisphere and it's registered in the right hemisphere. So, why is our experience singular? And what Puccetti suggests is he suggests it's singular because actually our experience is just of a single hemisphere. You're either the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, but consciousness doesn't span both. So, I mean, this is quite a radical suggestion. But obviously, if we adopt this view of Puccetti's view, then fission cases really pose no problem at all to personal identity. All fission does is, there's two people all along. Even in a normal person, there are two people there. And if you split the brain in half, that just kind of makes it apparent that there are two people. So that's quite a radical view. And I should add, it's questionable his interpretation of the clinical literature on split brain patients. So you would want to look that up before taking him at his word there. But It's an interesting idea. So another response we might have to fission and fusion cases is to ask whether they really make sense. Fission and fusion are rather wild thought experiments, and it's questionable whether thought experiments like these really tell us anything about the real people in the real world. Now, both fission and fusion assume that we can simply split the brain in half and then keep the different halves alive. Actually, that's not possible. The surgical operations I described are not true examples of this. A hemispherectomy does not destroy half a brain, rather it removes one cerebral hemisphere. The cerebral hemispheres are the top part of the brain. Hemispherectomy usually doesn't affect, for example, the cerebellum or the brainstem. So actually there's more than just half the brain preserved. Cutting out half a brain entirely would I assume kill the patient. Similarly, split brain patients don't have entirely split brains. The operation only severs the corpus callosum, but it often leaves intact the posterior and anterior commissures and the interthalamic adhesion and a few other things. So there's still some communication between the two hemispheres. And furthermore, as I mentioned with respect to the Puccetti case, with respect to Puccetti's argument, the psychological literature on split brain patients is open to a lot of interpretation. Some people suggest there are two consciousnesses or two people in one head, but others have a different interpretation of it. So, I mean, could we actually split a brain fully in half? I would assume not. I think that if you were to sever all of the subcortical regions, that would again probably kill the patient. Certainly it would seriously damage functions in the higher brain areas. So true fission and true fusion are not really possible, not even in principle. And with that in mind, these are science fiction cases, so who knows what to say in such a case? We're really just relying on our imagination here. We're inventing an impossible scenario and imagining what things might be like. This is science fiction. We don't really know what the consequences of fission or fusion would be to our talk of personhood in the real world. Kathleen Wilkes, in her book Real People, has a great discussion of the problems with appealing to thought experiments to draw conclusions about personal identity. So the defender of the psychological continuity theory might say, well, look, psychological continuity works perfectly well as a criterion of identity for normal people and for real people. Who cares whether or not it works in science fiction scenarios? That's just not what it's supposed to do. The point of this theory is to explain the nature of personal identity in real people, in real conditions. So it really doesn't matter, what our intuitions say about cutting brains in half or fusing brains together. So that is psychological continuity theory. I hope you found that interesting. We'll obviously be looking at some other theories in the next video, but that's all for now. Thank you for watching.